Metal is always protest music. I will say later where I got that from. The point of this, this talk is to make the argument that we have to kind of forget everything we know about globalization and heavy metal and non-Western people if we're going to really do justice to the subject of Indonesian heavy metal. And this is one reason why I like the idea of phenomenology and ethnomusicology, because of this idea of bracketing. It's an idea really that comes from Husserl. And very briefly, the idea of phenomenological bracketing is you take everything you think you know and you bracket it, you set it aside, and you just try to understand the phenomenon for what it is. I've spent the last 21 years ago, I first went to Indonesia, talking about how people in Indonesia have appropriated heavy metal music and made it their own. And they've taken this Western culture and they've done new things with it. They've used heavy metal music to talk about Islam. They've used heavy metal music to bring down a dictatorial regime. They've used heavy metal music to explore aspects of traditional cultures, to explore their history. They've used heavy metal music to be cool. They've used heavy metal music in all these different ways. But at what point does it stop making sense to talk about appropriation? Does it make sense to talk about appropriating your own culture? Because this has been going on for not just 21 years since I got there, but when I got there, it was clear this had been going on for at least 10 years prior to my showing up. So is the language of appropriation even appropriate for this sort of situation? Okay, so I understand that maybe not everyone knows a whole lot about Indonesia, and that's fine. So we're going to start with a map. All right, so that's Indonesia. And I didn't bring my laser pointer. So that's Java. That's the most populated island in Indonesia. It's a bunch of islands. It's an archipelago nation. And it's the fourth most populous nation in the world. It's the third largest democracy in the world. It's been a democracy since 1998. It's the world's largest Muslim country in the world, majority Muslim. And it's also known for this. So this is Gugat, it means shock or jolt. They're from Bandung, which is the capital of West Java. One of the singers, her name's Aceh, has the Muslim headscarf. She decided to wear it when she got married. Her day job is she's a kindergarten teacher. She doesn't tend to use that voice with them, though. And they're from Ujung Berung, which is a particular lower middle class neighborhood in Bandung, which may be the death metal capital of the entire world right now. But to understand them, we have to go back a bit. How did metal get to Indonesia? Well, in the form of recordings. It was a long time before bands actually started going there. Bands, including Southeast Asia in their sort of world tours, actually came fairly late. And they found tens of thousands of people very hungry to see them. Because prior to their arrival, there were often bootleg cassettes, but even some legitimate cassettes, often being sold, well, illegally at shows and at special places called distros, where you could get sort of contraband imported cassettes. And increasingly, a lot of these cassettes are homemade, homegrown metal cassettes. And increasingly, they're no longer cassettes. This is from 2000. But they're recorded by Indonesian bands themselves, either they're sort of under demo conditions or by small labels owned by peers. Now, it's important to note that this all happened before the internet. The internet, of course, accelerates this, but before the internet, there was this thing called tape trading, and there was a thing called the mail. Some of you may have heard of it. It takes a very long time to get things from Canada to the United States. You probably heard complaints about that, but you could also, in that time, send a lot of things to Indonesia, and people would have pen pals. In fact, we found out a friend of ours who's into metal in our hometown of Bowling Green, Ohio, had corresponded with one of the major metal bands in Jakarta a long, long time ago, like back in 1989. Just a guy, at that time was living in West Virginia. So these guys would spread their net far and wide, not using email even, but using the post and sending tapes and zines through the mail. And they would get tapes, stickers, and t-shirts, or they would make their own t-shirts. And that way they would get plugged in to this worldwide network. I've called this indie globalization. And this was also true for alternative music, for hardcore music, for punk. And, well, what happened, with all this activity in the 1990s? People learning about punk and metal and hardcore. Well, one of the things that happens is they learn about all the stuff that had been really actually banned by the Indonesian government, which at the time was under a dictatorship. Things like socialism and anarchism and straight edge and all these kind of radical ideologies that were actually formally illegal in the country. And maybe it wasn't a big deal. In 1997, I saw these groups perform, and they didn't have many fans relative to the youth population of Indonesia, even though there was a large college student fan base for these groups. But in 1998, there was a revolution. And a lot of the people who demonstrated against the government, they were fans of this music and told me they were turned on to sort of resistance against oppression by listening to not even just the obscure bands, but bands like Rage Against the Machine. Sort of the more mainstream bands even, or bands like Metallica. But more than that, they knew about way more obscure bands, like Fugazi, or No Means No, or Husker Du. Things that I had no idea they would know about, but they did because of tape trading. They knew about bands like Sickness and Cannibal Corpse. They loved Cannibal Corpse. So rather obscure things. That was the beginning of me thinking that this whole kind of model of globalization that we have, of multinational corporations and powerful countries shoving culture down people's throat, didn't work so well when you're talking about something like punk or metal. Because it seemed like this was a situation where people were aggressively going and grabbing the culture they wanted, which was the opposite of the conventional model of cultural imperialism and sort of top-down globalization. It just didn't seem to fit. That this was music that people wanted, and they went in search of it. So it didn't seem to connect. But every time I suggested that, I would be shouted down, because no, this was neocolonialism. This was imperialism. Unless, of course, I was talking to someone from a developing country, and then often I would get a much different response. Like, they would be like, yeah, about time someone said that. So, still, it's hard to say, because certainly there's enough examples of the horrible effects of globalization that people don't want to admit that sometimes people go out and grab what they want. So that's May 21st, 1998. And people are now kind of nostalgic about the good old days of resistance and revolution. I want to talk about what happens in July 2014 in Indonesia. I guess a lot of you don't know. But a pretty important event if you're a metalhead or someone who cares about Indonesia, and that is this guy becomes president. This is Joko Widodo, universally known as Jokowi. Jokowi has a very interesting biography. He started out as a furniture salesman in Java, and is an ardent heavy metal fan. He talks about seeing heavy metal groups growing up, and talks about them as motivating him, making him excited, really liking the sound of it. So that's led to some interesting things, like when the Danish Prime Minister met him, he gave him a copy of Metallica's Master of Puppets, signed by Lars Ulrich, who is Danish, if you didn't know, the drummer of Metallica. And he was personally responsible for bringing Metallica back in 2013 to play Jakarta. And it's caused a minor ripple in sort of the metal world, having a metalhead president. Has he been a good president? Well, he's a political leader. He's had pros and cons. But he's a lot better than the guy he beat, who was a general from the dictatorship age, who was very keen on disassembling the democracy that Indonesians had built. And Jokowi narrowly defeated him in an election in 2014, and in July, and then in October, he became president. And I bring him up here partially to show how important metal became in this country, which does have one of the biggest metal scenes on Earth, I think. In the sort of encyclopedia of metal bands, they have about 1,600, which is a lot for Asia, not a lot for the world, but I think that has a lot to do with the fact that it's still a relatively poor country and you need a lot of resources to play in a heavy metal band. But also, this idea of heavy metal as a motivator, gets you motivated, cuts through your apathy and makes you want to do things. That was the origin of the line, heavy metal to me is always protest music. That was said to us by a friend of ours, Robin, who played guitar in a band called Poopin', Robin Malau, and he talked about how heavy metal also motivated him. That it was a motivating force because it was music that was energetic. And just wanted to share with you a nice quote from The Economist They're not known for their rosy idealism. They actually wrote, "Nobody thought that Indonesia would become a model of democracy overnight. The hope, however, had been that after a drastic political decentralization in 2001, it would start producing grassroots politicians with a record of efficient and honest administration who would progress to national politics. Jokowi is the proof that democracy works." You know, people were optimistic in those days, but they've got a point. Someone recently wrote that Jokowi has built more roads in Indonesia since becoming president than anyone had in the previous 30 years. He has not been a completely unsuccessful president. In fact, Indonesia has prospered in many ways. Now, this is all just a factual sketch, just to get everyone sort of on the same page. I'm going to get to the meatier stuff in a moment. I wanted to say all this just, you know, as a background. If you want to know more, well, actually, there are people who know a lot more about this stuff than me at this point, because back when I was doing this in the beginning, I felt like I was the only one. Well, I wasn't. I mean, Craig Lockhart had written some stuff, and at the time, Emma Balch was writing stuff. Since then, there are now all these people writing about underground music in Indonesia. Some of them are Indonesian, and some of them are Finnish, and some of them are British, and some of them are American, and some of them are Australian. But there are quite a lot of people, and it's quite gratifying. So those of you who are scholars out there in the audience, don't think that your work is inconsequential. Because once it's out there, it starts influencing people. It starts getting followers. And so right now, all these people were influenced by what I was doing when I was thinking, no one's ever going to take this seriously. This is so weird. No one ever told me that there are so many punks and metalheads in this country. I thought it was all, you know, this stuff, you know, Gamelan behind me. No. Okay, so if you are expecting me to give you concrete proof that heavy metal caused the downfall of the Soeharto regime or caused Jokowi to win the election, I'm not going to do that. Don't have it. No one has done that research, and I don't think you can find that proof, honestly. I don't know if it's, by definition, quantifiable. What I'm going to do instead is share with you two logical propositions. This is the first one. Logical proposition number one. Unquantifiable does not mean zero. Okay, so it's kind of a patronizing example, but okay. So if a guy walks up to you with a full jar of jelly beans, and he says, "I don't know how many jelly beans are in here," and you say, "Oh, so you have zero," that doesn't make a lot of sense. But if it's unquantifiable, it's not the same as zero, even though you can't possibly count all those jelly beans. All right, that's the best I can do. All right, but unquantifiable does not mean zero. We don't know how people are influenced by music, how their behavior is influenced by music. I don't think that's an equation that anyone will ever be able to figure out. All right, proposition number two. Negative does not mean true, and cynicism does not equal objectivity. You know how critics like movies with sad endings? Does that mean movies with sad endings are better than movies with happy endings? It doesn't mean that that's always the case, but a lot of academics will go towards the cynical and negative because, well, it sounds more scholarly. It sounds more respectable. It's easier to sound smart if you're going to say something negative. But of course, we already know the world sucks. The fact is, good things do happen, and we have to explain those too. So, being negative doesn't mean you're smarter. It just means you're more negative. Right? So, I figure, if you're smart, try to think of something positive because being smart means you should do hard things, I think. All right. So, ultimately, I think when you're talking about how to assess the political agency of metal in Indonesia, you have to ask another question first. And conventional theories of globalization are not going to help you. So you instead have to ask, well, first of all, then, what does heavy metal mean in Indonesia? And that's not a straightforward question, because it doesn't mean the same thing in Indonesia that it might mean in Newfoundland or anywhere else in North America. One thing that I was struck by is the consistent way in which it is embedded in everyday life in a culture that is different in its everyday life from most everyday life experiences in the United States or Canada, right? So to show you what I mean, we are all used to seeing scenes like this one. Heavy metal band plays in front of throngs of people at a big outdoor show. And there's plenty of footage like this on YouTube. Far more unusual is seeing heavy metal played in another context, which is actually pretty common in Indonesia, and that is at a local festival on a sort of festival stage. I found this interesting clip of the same band. This is a group called Demon's Dam, doing a song that roughly translated from the Sundanese means recovery from fatigue. I saw them playing this in a small town on the beach in a place called Rembang between Surabaya and Semarang in central Java. And they don't sound great because they're playing on a communally used drum kit, other people's amps, and instead of throngs of people, the only people who are kind of grooving to the music are a bunch of kids. So it's a really extraordinary a bit of footage here.
Dari Dimas Dam,
Done by
datang jauh dari Bandung. Pengen lihat kalian lebih brutal dari ini. Oke.
Nuoros, no, Galeon!
Now,
Dari Dimas.
this brings up the whole question of transgression and mundanity. And this is our friend Aryan 13, that's how you say 13 in Indonesian. Heavy metal is a part of life. It's not as scary, I think, because it's just music to a lot of folks. Strange music maybe, but not threatening in the same way that it might be to folks in the West. You saw sort of a multi-generational kind of curious, perhaps nonplussed crowd there. That's generally the reaction that it gets when it's played in sort of a public forum like that, which it often is. And what I actually see there is an extension of logic in metal culture to some extent. So this is our friend Aryan 13 with his cat Lemmy, just in his studio. And this picture actually captures a certain essence of heavy metal in a way. The seriousness and the silliness kind of in combination with each other. The seriousness, of course, the tattoos and the heavy metal t-shirt, and then the silly face and the silly cat. Some of you may be aware there's a whole book called Heavy Metal Cats. And it's a bunch of scary-looking metal dudes mugging for the camera with their cute cats. It's a whole book, and it's a pretty big seller. So this, if there was an Indonesian version of Heavy Metal Cats, this would be Aryan's picture. And Aryan is kind of a rock star in Indonesia. He was in Pupin, and this is a picture of him in Pupin. And then he's now in Seringai. But this is him 11 years before that last picture was taken. So if death metal has been indigenized to some extent, how can we approach this theoretically in a way that is productive, in a way that doesn't just reinscribe our own biased view of what it means when non-Western people play Western music, and one that might even account for how Indonesian metal has changed Indonesian society, or at least has shaped it in a way that maybe has led to more democracy. Because I would argue that it has. Well, there are perhaps ways to do it. This is where it gets a little technical, because I'm talking about the work of these dead guys. Okay, so the first one is Charles Sanders Peirce, the second one is Theodor Adorno, and the last one is Alfred Schutz. And I'll talk about the first one first. And I'm going to be very simplified. Okay. And I know we started late, so I'm going to be very simplified. Basically, I argue in the piece I wrote about punk that meaning is not just sign and object. It's got to have this third element to be coherent, to be understood. Well, that argument comes from Peirce. He said that there needs to be a sign, object, and an interpretant. And I've argued that that interpretant has to be everyday life in some way with appropriating popular music. That popular music has to have some link to everyday experience to be meaningful. That when Indonesians or anyone else takes Western popular music, that if they're not connecting it to their real lives, then they're not going to find it meaningful. That whenever we see anyone start rapping or start playing Beatles songs or start playing reggae, they're not doing it because reggae equals cool. They're doing it because reggae equals cool and is relevant to my life. It has to have some sort of triangular formation. That there needs to be some link to real life in any kind of musical appropriation that happens, any kind of taking of musical ideas from elsewhere. And that is actually predicted by a triangular model of meaning. All right. And now there's the blank screen. So I can explain Adorno's critique of authenticity in like 3 words. Most people know Adorno because he writes cranky opinion pieces on popular music. I'm not talking about them. And some people even have argued that Adorno would like metal. Of course they would hate it. That's not what this is about. No, Adorno would hate everything that people think he would like. But that's not what this is about. Adorno critiques the idea of authenticity because he sees it as non-dialectical. He sees it as only about the self and being true to oneself. But I think looking at the authenticity of underground music in Indonesia is about understanding that it is also dialectical. That people used underground music as a vehicle to understanding their social situation, as a vehicle for placing themselves vis-a-vis not only the world metal scene, but also understanding themselves vis-a-vis their society. And that was very apparent certainly before and after the fall of the New Order, but I think it's still true now. So understanding popular music as rooted in everyday life addresses Adorno's critique of authenticity. And then what people really said, besides that in Indonesia, what people really told me is besides the underground music helping them express themselves, the other thing they said is that underground music was good for pergaulan or nongkrong, which is hanging out and socializing. And that's where you get Albert Schutz, where he argues that music helps people get in tune with each other. And Esther Glitton and I have written a piece about how hanging out and talking about music is kind of almost like playing music, that you get in tune to other people. And that socializing, that's what music scenes are made of. And there's something very mundane about death metal. It's really great for building scenes because it all sounds the same. It's all extreme. If you like it, you're definitely in the club. And people will go all over the place to just play and talk about death metal. That clip I showed you, Demon Sam was playing in Rembang. Rembang is actually really far from their home base in Bandung. So death metal is about community. And it definitely is about that in Indonesia. And to understand, that's not just about showing how much you know, but it's about meeting other people and forming community. Actually, Schutz and Schutzian phenomenology helps us get there. So you have alternatives to just simple top-down theories of globalization for understanding the impact of heavy metal culture in a place like Indonesia. So what's the takeaway? This is a picture of our trip to Indonesia this past summer. This is members of the band Coil and Wendy from Rolling Stone and Rebecca Moore, who invited us, the ethnomusicologist, and Ariane again. The takeaway is that in order to really understand phenomena like heavy metal in Indonesia and its relationship to social change, we need to put aside our prejudices, to put aside our preconceived notions about what popular music means in other parts of the world. That is essential because it's not just Indonesia's successful transition to democracy, which started in 1998 and was sealed in 2014 with the first truly democratic presidential election there. But it also is true of the Arab Spring. It's true of what happened in Tunisia in 2011. It's true of the Iranian uprising, the unsuccessful one, in 2009. It's also true of street protests that have happened many times all over the world. There has almost always been a prominent popular music element in those protests or a popular culture element in those protests. And usually it has been dismissed as, oh, well, they're just copying the West, or they're just, it's just some sort of affectation. It's not. Without the song by El General, the Tunisian rapper, Bouad el-Azizi probably would have died in vain. There wouldn't have been an Arab Spring. There were songs about the martyrdom that led to the uprising in 2009 against Ahmadinejad. You know, this is not an isolated thing, what happened in Indonesia. Metal, rap, punk, they have been used to create significant social change, and we've mostly ignored it. So I hope that's the takeaway. And that's pretty much all I want to say. So thank you.
The question really was always, I mean, if on any given night some of us didn't show up, then the punk scene in Austin, Texas was a lot smaller. And a lot, more specialized, you know. So I would say there was, while we were all doing some similar tropes and all this, there was no question of we want to be like New York or we want to be like LA. We hadn't really, the question was, who are we? And which parts of this are us? So I just was, wanting to say it was very much a way we defined ourselves rather than looking to someone else's culture, the New York culture or the LA culture and saying, we want, that's the gold standard. We want that. No one said that. So.
Yeah. I mean, different scenes define themselves in different ways vis-a-vis other scenes. Relationships between scenes is a major issue. It remains so. I mean, the Toledo scene always defines itself in terms of how it relates to Detroit. And, the Malang scene in Indonesia defines itself and how it relates to Surabaya. Austin has always been an important scene for music. If you look at Barry Shank's book, Dissonant Identities, I mean, Austin has a very rich history of music and has a very distinct musical identity. So I'm not surprised to hear it has that kind of self-confidence. So that might have been a factor in that attitude. It took Indonesia much longer to have that kind of self-confidence. Certainly in the beginning of the 1990s, there was a lot more looking to America. There's much less of that now, but I think it took 30 years to have that kind of liberated attitude. But I think it's much more apparent now, depending on the band. But still, I think in general now, like there's the Bandung sound. And then, do you want to affiliate yourself with the Bandung sound or, not play like that? Or do you want to do something a little different? But, I think, a lot of metal scenes that are just starting out, they definitely feel the pull. But I think Austin, definitely has a proud tradition of its own and has a tradition of being nonconformist that may have fed into that. Because I mean, from what I know about the Toledo punk scene, they were definitely looking elsewhere. And Gesturing Elsewhere is actually a title of an article about the beginnings of Balinese death metal. Because they were looking at America, they were looking at England. And, a lot of scenes start out that way.
Thanks. This question comes from Kaylee McCath Moran, and it's about activism. She's asking, is there a place for activism and scholarship about white nationalism in black metal? And if so, what would that kind of activism look like?
There's a great deal of scholarship on white nationalism in black metal. It's actually received a great deal of attention. There are works by Ben Olson, Sherry Hockhauser, Ross Hagen. It's, I think, important to document it. I think it's received a great deal of attention to the extent that sometimes that's all people know about metal and underground metal culture. It's difficult to know what the place of activism is because so much metal studies has been ethnographic. So it's sort of been about, you sort of look at what these people do and understand their worldview. Other people in the scene have, taken a hard line against it, but that has been less from a scholarly perspective. I'm not sure if I addressed the question.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. I'm really struck by the two examples that you showed us, which were both mixed gender. Mm-hmm. And I don't know much about metal. Although weirdly, I've had two teenagers who listened to it incessantly for some time, but somehow I have a sound in my head, and I don't really know very much about what they were listening to except that sound I can conjure up. Mm-hmm. The sound that all those vocalists provided, right? Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the performance of self on stage in the Indonesian context and the proper Jamir Muslim wife kindergarten teacher? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Obviously, yeah, there's a lot to say.
Interesting performativity, yeah.
I think the short answer is that if you behave the proper way, according to the local gender norms, off stage, that's a lot more important than what you do on stage. I think it's a different way of understanding gender conformity than it tends to be dominant in North America. So it's not transgressive in the same way. That's a kind of short way of saying it. I don't want to give the impression that there are lots and lots of female singers. Those just happen to be two examples I used. They exist. Since the turn of the century, there have been more women involved as singers and other musicians in heavy metal bands, but it's not the norm by any stretch. But whether or not you're a proper Muslim wife is fairly irrelevant to your activities as a musician. There was actually a group of Muslim teenagers who wore headscarves who played in heavy metal band that actually got some coverage in the Western media. Voice of Bachaprot a few months ago, because it was such a novelty to see that to global audiences. It's not really that unusual. Lots of women in headscarves came to see me talk and really liked Coil's music. When I spoke at the American Embassy, lots of people wear headscarves in Indonesia right now. But that doesn't mean they can't be metalheads. And some of them even wear them on stage. And it's not seen as necessarily a contradiction by most people. But it's a complicated subject. Yeah.
Okay, because the interesting thing to me is the first thing you said, because I think that's an inversion of what often happens in the West, right? That your behavior publicly on stage gets endlessly critiqued and judged, and as opposed to your private behavior, right? Mm-hmm. So when you said that, it's how you behave in private that matters, and what you do on stage matters much less. Can you situate that in a little bit more for us? Like, what in Indonesian culture allows that to happen so interestingly?
I think it's about where the gender norms come from. I mean, they are derived from kinship obligations, as opposed to this necessary, desire to have gender be an inherent part of your identity. I think, it's a relational category that derives from viewing certain obligations for each individual within a web of kinship. And as far as that goes, your on-stage comportment is irrelevant. I think in the West we have a very strict gender ideology that demands that gender be viewed as an inherent category that has to be performed at all times. It has to be consistent. And that's just not it doesn't work the same way in societies where gender bending has a long history on stage, and it's not seen as threatening.
So I'm so curious about the government rules about banning this kind of music genre, because like in my country, the government also dominates many. They play a dominant, role in defining which kind of music you can play or cannot. So I just wonder, did the government give any particular rule, like for the reason why this music cannot develop here in my country? Something like that.
Well, it's something that a lot of people commented on when I was there this past summer. When we visited there, a lot of people said, why didn't the government ban this music when they had a chance? And one of the answers that people sort of gave when they speculated on this was, well, they couldn't understand what we were saying. A lot of the songs were in English, but even when they were in Indonesian, it was there was that Cookie Monster vocals is what they're called, and since no one could understand what they were saying, they figured this stuff was harmless. Also, really, it only seemed to appeal to a small group of students, and it seemed like Western culture, and the Soeharto government was pro-Western. So, maybe it was a mistake, but the government never really cracked down on any of this music, including some of the music that was critical of Soeharto. They just didn't know it existed. Now, in other countries, I know in China, you're supposed to submit your lyrics first. And certain heavy metal bands like Ordnance have been banned. There's a Taiwanese band, Phonic, if anyone knows them. They're not supposed to play in mainland China because they support Taiwanese independence. So there is a lot more censorship in some places. But in Indonesia, there was not a whole lot of censorship of punk and metal music because there just wasn't a lot of interest in doing that. Music was the only form of expression that wasn't heavily censored during the New Order, although pop music, stuff that was produced by the legitimate music industry, was censored. It wasn't censored heavily. You could get away with criticizing the government indirectly and sometimes get away with it. But this was all underground music. It was not produced through legitimate channels, and it was sold illegally. And there was never, to my knowledge, a crackdown of it. I think it was just too small, and I think its influence was underestimated. That's really all I can tell you. But right now in China and other places, other places in the Middle East, it's completely illegal.
Yeah, that's my country.
Chinese country.
Yeah. So I ask about it because, well, I know like my government, they have kind of this confusion thinking about the music and the social order. So for example, I think this kind of music banned by my government, they think this music cause chaos in this society. So they, for example, heavy metal, they don't understand what they are saying, and they think these heavy things cause people anxious about the whole society. So that's why they think this music should not appear in front of my people. So I just asked because I was wondering if this is the kind of same reason why the government think the philosophy part of this music.
For whatever reason, there wasn't a whole lot of censorship of heavy metal. There was a little bit in the 90s when there was a riot after a Metallica concert in 1993, but that was it. Now, China has been inconsistent about heavy metal. They have allowed some concerts and not allowed others. So when Cannibal Corpse went to China, they brought their instruments with them, but they didn't play any legal shows. They would just go to a place and start playing. And people talked about it through word of mouth. Testament was apparently the first thrash metal band to actually play in China legally. They actually got away with it. Other bands have shown up and then have been prevented from playing. I had a student who actually wrote a whole master's thesis about this, Yu Zhang, that's now on, you can get it as a PDF. But, you know, heavy metal used to be really, really big in China with Tangqiao. But then had to go underground when the government decided they didn't like it.
I'd be interested to hear more of your thoughts on the metal scene's maybe impact with the election of a metalhead prime minister or president in Indonesia. I think like perhaps in the West we take for granted a lot the freedom to go to a show, or even that a tape could be considered contraband. And now the fact that he said metal is such a motivator for possibly him becoming or wanting to pursue politics. How does that correlation, do you think, or what does that say about Indonesian culture that now they have, or how it's grown from, like, how does metal, I guess, what does that say about where Indonesian culture is heading perhaps in the future?
That's a very good question. I mean, Jokowi's got a lot of supporters, but he's also got a lot of enemies. And the enemies have gotten stronger in a sense. I mean, people were pretty bummed when we were there because one of Jokowi's allies, who became governor of Jakarta after him, was thrown in jail for blaspheming the Quran. I mean, basically, if you remember, if you've ever heard about what happened to heavy metal in the 1980s in the United States, those same kind of people don't like it in Indonesia either, and they also don't like Jokowi, and they're getting pretty powerful. So it's a fraught situation. And also not all the metalheads like Jokowi, because Jokowi's, you know, he's in power, he's a politician. It's not like, you know, we got there and people were like, oh yeah, he's our guy, we love him. They were like, yeah, he's our president, whatever. You know, they were very kind of ambivalent about him, even though they helped put him in office. I mean, you know, it wasn't like this whole let's all get together and do this kind of thing, because metalheads aren't like that, even there. You know, they're like, no, no one tells us what to do. You know, maybe some people will vote, maybe they won't. You know, no one tells us what to do. I don't tell people what to do. We all do what we want. And that was their attitude. People wondered, you know, are metalheads going to go vote for this guy? And I think in the end they did, because they saw that someone had to do it. And he ended up winning by more than they thought they would, more than they thought he would. But, you know, we did not get the sense that people felt a whole lot of validation from it, because he is being assaulted from all sides by conservative, religious fundamentalist and militarist sides of the society. And not even everyone in the metal scene supports him. So I think that, you know, since 1998 there have been, you know, substantial freedoms of expression in the country within certain limits. I think metal has had, you know, pretty much free reign since even before the end of the Soeharto period. I mean, that's why the underground scene was able to flourish in the 1990s. So I think it's complicated, but certainly it's the freest metal scene anywhere in Southeast Asia. I mean, right next door to Malaysia, they have to deal with a lot of censorship issues and upsetting the government and upsetting the surrounding people. I think that metal has more legitimacy now because of Jokowi, but no one ever gives him credit.
This question comes from Putu Kira, and his question is, do you find the indigenization of metal musics in Indonesia comparable to changing musical aesthetics in more quote-unquote traditional musics, such as Gamelan, or to cosmological perspectives or ideologies?
It's interesting, Gamelan kind of went the opposite direction compared to punk or metal. Gamelan was a traditional music that kind of got defined by Westerners who came in and said, this is kind of like our classical music. So let's do this and this and this. By contrast, heavy metal music and punk music came to Indonesia as cassettes, and Indonesians decided what to do with it. So it was almost the exact opposite process. Instead of Westerners coming to Indonesia and telling them what to do with their music, Westerners sent their music and Indonesians decided what to do with it. So it's in some ways a complementary process. And in certain cases, the imported music has been totally incorporated into non-Western cosmologies. I mean, there's Javanese black metal, there's Balinese death metal, and some of it has been completely absorbed. Gamelan, of course, has been completely repurposed too to play Gamelan contemporaire, sort of avant-garde classical music played on gamelan, which also I think has a lot of resonance with traditional gamelan aesthetics. And a lot of Western art composers composed for gamelan. A lot of them don't even know anything about Indonesia. So it goes both ways. But I think it says a lot about sort of the nature of the musical world we live in, that it goes both ways. And of course, there is a certain amount of gamelan metal. There's, Balinese gamelan math metal, and there's of course Eternal Madness, which I urge everyone to look up. They're on YouTube. Eternal Madness is a band that combines fast, crazy gamelan with fast, crazy death metal. They've been doing it for over 20 years, and it's heady stuff. Yeah, they're the centerpiece of the Balinese death metal scene, or actually really the Balinese underground scene. They're based in Denpasar, and they're very serious about what they do. And yeah, they have no imitators, because it's not easy to really hybridize music if you're going to do it right. I don't know if that answers your question, but TV person. But I think it really can go both ways, and I think it's complicated, how those intersect. Yes.
Thanks very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you, I'm curious to know if metal has been used in Indonesia to spread any particular brand of Islam. I'm thinking, for example, of, Roma Irama's tune. It's that canonic piece in the world music literature, the Quran versus the newspapers. Yes. Where he's critical of Hong Kong, especially as a conduit for Western globalization.
Yeah.
And I'm just, at any rate, but it's also a piece about Islam.
Yes.
In the Dangdut style. And I'm just wondering if metal is used to the same purpose, for the same purposes.
In Indonesia, practically every genre of popular music has a sort of dakwah offshoot, and metal is no exception. There is a movement called the metal satu jari. It means one finger metal, and the idea is instead of this, you have this, and that's one god. And it's basically a metal dakwah movement. And unfortunately, some of it is militant, sort of Wahhabist Islam, sort of militant, like ISIS kind of Islam. But a lot of it is just, religiosity, sort of Roma Irama type Islam, sort of, pray 5 times a day and fast over Ramadan and know your saints and, learn to speak Arabic and just be pious. And it actually covers the full range. The Bandung scene, which is the dominant scene in Indonesian metal, is defiantly secular. For them, religion is your own business. But right now, the punk scene has become very interested in Islam, and some kinds of really dogmatic Islam. But it's analogous.
Well, that's all we have time for this evening. I'd like to thank you so much, Dr. Wallach, for such a wonderful and inspiring talk this evening. I'd like to thank Spencer Crew, our director, camera operators, Christian Daubel, and Ellen McCutcheon, Dr. Megan Forsyth, our social media host, and all of you for coming. If you missed any part of tonight's talk, it'll be available on our YouTube channel, probably in the next couple of weeks. I want to wish all of you and Two Sprites a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.